Hey, it's Joe West from the West Barn. We are on hiatus this week, celebrating Thanksgiving. Today, we're airing a best of show with Uber rock legend producer Michael Beinhorn. Enjoy. We'll see you next week. Hey, it's Joe West from the West Barn with
Mike Shimshack.
And today, our guest is super producer Michael Beinhorn. You know him from all the records he's done. Records for Hole, for, of course, Superunknown, for our very favorite band of the decade, Soundgarden, Aerosmith, Social Distortion, Red Hot Chili Peppers. It goes on and on. Herbie Hancock, which he won a Grammy for. As a player, though, right?
No.
Oh, okay.
Co-wrote and co-produced. Yeah.
Okay. We'll get into all that. I don't want to snip it out and put it up here in the front. But he's coming to us from Colorado, and we are proud and we'd love to have him here. Thank you so much, Michael. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure.
I want to remind everyone before we start to please hit subscribe and hit any notifications you may need if you're on Facebook, or not Facebook, but on YouTube. Hit the notifications and hit that little bell too. Michael Beinhorn is one of those guys, if you're coming out and you're in the music business, it's like he's just on another level. When I was in New York City, I can remember hearing stories about him, one of which I want him to tell us about his trying to get rid of a ground loop at Right Track Studios, which is a fabled one that I didn't believe until he told me. But, he's just at another level, and you can get successful eventually, but there's always that crew of guys that you put up on a pedestal, and you've been that for me. So thank you for being that for all of us. And being such a cool, approachable guy. Michael volunteered his time and did an evening with my school, the Apprentice Academy, and pulled no punches. He told those guys exactly what they needed to hear, and they were better for it. So thank you, buddy, and welcome.
My pleasure.
So, the biggest record, everyone, it's so different because people listen to music, and some records are big for some people, not big for others. But I think Superunknown was a big record for everybody. That was like, when you did that record, did it change your life? You were all already a huge success, but was that something that you just were not prepared for?
Well, yes and no kind of thing. I don't know. I mean, it's completely transformational. There's no question about it. But coming into that record, I just had a gut feeling that it was going to be something very special. Like it had to be. And that was my job. Like, my job was to try and do everything possible to help push it over the edge. So there was this really great anticipation on my part. And then I heard demos for the record, and I was like, oh, because it was, there were a bunch of really, there was a lot of music on it. There was about 11 tracks. And there were about 3 or 4 things on it that were good and wound up getting used, but the rest of it was just like, I don't think we can make a record with this, guys. And that was a tough conversation to have, because I just met them, and here they were entrusting their baby to me, and I had to come back to them with that. But I realized that it wasn't going to be what everyone needed it to be, and have that conversation with them.
Well, that's a skill in of its own, because there's a lot of producers that are just like they're cheerleaders, and you are not afraid to have tough conversations about drummers, about songs, about what the record needs. So I love that about the creative process. When you're in a room with talented people, if they're willing to have the fight about the music, it's totally forgivable. If it turns into an ego thing, then everybody's fighting for ego and you can hate one another. But I love that you were willing to have tough conversations about, hey, this record isn't ready, where most people would be like, I don't want to lose the gig. But you're willing to lose the gig.
Yeah, yeah, I am. I don't like confrontation at all. I think I probably like it less than most people, but there's certain things that I'm just not going to countenance. And if you've paid me to work on your project and to have that kind of responsibility, I have to do my job. And my job in a case like that, my ethics they won't permit me to slack. I think it's genetic. So, if I'm faced with the option of like, hey, I have to say something that might lose me a gig, or, just walk away and pretend everything's okay because I really want to work and I really want to make the money, I'm going to go with option A every time, because that's the way I'm wired. And honestly, I believe in this position, you have ethics, and you have to live by them.
How do you do that? How do you tell Soundgarden that out of the 11 songs they sent you, 9 of them were no good, and you don't want to record them?
I had to explain the situation to them. I said that I felt very strongly that they didn't have enough material to make a full record, that we couldn't go into a recording studio with what they had. And I had to be firm about it, just to say to them, look, we can't go into a recording studio with unless the quality of material is up to the standard that you guys need. I mean, at least, they'd already set like several bars with their previous records. Let's not go below that bar. Let's take a look at this. I mean, a lot of the music that was on there was a little bit more jammy. It was kind of the aspect of Soundgarden that I'm personally not a fan of. I felt that when they went off onto these kind of like jams, I know that a lot of people like that about them very much. But to me, because the material is, to me, the structural elements of the material are more important. So I wasn't as interested in listening to them jam on a record. I'm like, if I want to hear that, I'll see them live. Like, I want to hear these guys' ability to be able to create like a great song structure, or an idea that has parts that work together. I love constructed music. I mean, jam music is great too, but I feel like once you've listened to that on a recording a bunch of times, it just it starts to get lackluster. Right. That's my experience with it anyhow. Whereas if you're dealing with, like, I mean, I can listen to, Bach, like, the musical offering. You can listen to that over and over. If you like Baroque music, you can listen to that over and over again. And it's so complex. And it's so amazing and intricate. The way, the fact that came from one person, that he was able to use an ensemble of instruments to create that kind of mesh, it's extraordinary, because you're actually, you're listening to a guy's brain work, but you're also hearing how they're able to evoke that and communicate that through a bunch of instruments. And to me, that's special. That's more special than listening to a record with a bunch of guys jamming.
Well, and kudos to Soundgarden for being willing to hear that, right? Because that's got to be tough too. You show up with 11 things and your producer says, respectfully, I disagree, and I don't think it's in the best interest of the brand and the music and what it is we were setting out to do. That's hard for them to do, and kudos to them for being able to say, okay, he fought for the music and he was compelling. Yeah,
that's very well put. I'm walking into a minefield just by presenting that to them, and they have every right to basically tell me, hey, you know what? We'll get someone else to do this record. You're fired.
Absolutely, they're lined up.
They didn't do it. I mean, they didn't like hearing that at all. But like, because obviously, to a certain extent, that can be taken as an insult, even if it's not meant that way. But it really speaks. It does speak to their character mightily. Yeah.
Yeah.
In the end, did they appreciate the craft and everything that went into it?
No.
I had a feeling.
That's a perfect response.
Well, I don't think there's any reason to pull any. No, they didn't. And it was, honestly, it's their record. It was their prerogative not to. And I can't take that away from them. Their lack of appreciation, also for how the record was made, because it was pretty painstaking.
I bet.
but they, you know, they let it happen anyhow, and I think, and obviously the results spoke for themselves.
They sure did. Now, didn't you tell me that you found Black Hole Sun on a cassette? It was at the end, and you were mentioning, like, what is up with this song? And they were like, oh, do you like that? Tell us the story of Black Hole Sun. Was it on that 11 that they originally sent, or?
No. Actually, what was happening was that Chris was sending batches of demos to me, and he sent a batch of like 12 or 13 songs at one point, which I listened to them and I was like, oh God, you know, I've heard them since, and they're not bad. I mean, I'd say by today's standards that I think they would stack up pretty well. But at that point in time, they were so off the mark. I mean, it wasn't the record that they needed to make at that point in time. I could just feel it in my bones. And I was like, I have to talk to this guy about this, because he's definitely, he's swerving away from what this feels like it should be. You know, I mean, it's again, you're wading into very dangerous water. You know, taking a position like that, not being a co-composer in this music. So I knew what I was getting myself into, but I was like, I didn't have time to kind of second guess the whole thing. So I called him and I was like, listen, we got to talk about these demos. And what I really wanted to, I didn't want to get into like hey, you're not doing the right kind of music. These songs aren't hitting the mark. It was more like, what are you thinking about? What are these songs for? Like, who are you writing these songs for? What is this about? What is this record to? Like, who are you trying to reach? And I started to realize, based on what he was telling me, that he was writing a record for Soundgarden fans. And I was like, oh, no, like, this record, like, whatever you do, this has to be what that came from deep inside of you. And, we talked about the kind of music that he was into. And, excuse me, I asked him point blank, what do you listen to? And he's like, the Beatles and Cream mainly. And I was like, okay, write a song that sounds like the Beatles and Cream then.
Oh, that does too.
And
a lot of Beatles.
Yeah, and he was like, but what about it? What if it doesn't sound like Soundgarden? I was like, don't worry about that. When you guys play the song together, you'll make it sound like Soundgarden, because you are Soundgarden. You can't write music for people who you've never met, whose shoes you haven't walked in, whose lives you haven't lived. Like, just, make music that feels like you, do that. You'll make it great. And 3 weeks later, I get this cassette tape, new demos. There's 4 songs on it. The first song was Fell on Black Days, which, I mean, if you know that record, you know that song. The minute I heard it, I was like, oh, God. I was like, yeah, that's it. And then the second song was a song called Anxious, which never got cut, but it had Jerry Cantrell in it. It was more bluesy. It was really... The third was a song called Tighter and Tighter, which I wanted to cut, and they wound up doing Down on the Upside, and which I loved. And the fourth song was Black Hole Sun. And you may remember when I was talking about this, I remember how I felt the minute, the very instant the first few notes came on. I was like, what in the holy hell is this? What am I listening to? Goosebumps just thinking about it right now. It just blew me away completely.
What is the Leslie type guitar sound going on in there? It might be a Leslie. I don't know.
Well, it's kind of a Fender Leslie kind of co-branding thing. It's a Leslie or a Fender 16. I think Fender at one point sold it as a Vibro Flux or Vibro. I can't remember. But it's not like a standard rotating speaker that sits on the top of a Leslie cabinet. It's actually a rotating speaker that sits inside a speaker enclosure, and it goes around and around this way. So there's a cone facing out, but there's some kind of weird port on the speaker itself. It's actually covered with fabric. There's a port that allows the sound to come out of one little part of it, and you can control it like a Leslie. But there's no actual amplifier in it. So you have to use a separate guitar head to power it up.
And there's a ton of vibrato in that tone. So there's something more than spinning speakers, and Doppler. It's bigger pitch deviation
That's
than
it.
that. Wow.
That's it.
That's
That's
incredible.
it. That's all it is. It's this little, it's like a little speaker traveling round and round inside this cabinet.
Wow.
It's
Because there's
amazing.
so much pitch deviation to it.
Stevie Ray Vaughan used to use these things as well, actually. I'd never seen one before he brought it in, and I was like, oh my gosh, that thing sounds incredible.
Oh wow. So when you called him, he didn't have high expectations for that song, right? He was more like, hey, oh, you like that? Like, wasn't that sort of the...
Yeah. The next, it wasn't the next day. I listened to, God, I think I've told this story so many times. I feel like a broken record, but like, I literally played that song 15 times in a row. I could not stop listening to it. It was so good. It was making me, how a song just kind of like has such a visceral effect on you that you start having, a really profound emotional response to it. And you kind of feel it in different places in your body. You're like, oh,
yeah.
I had this, like, it was like taking psychedelics, it was that profound. And I called this guy up and I was like, you're a goddamn genius. And he's like, what? I was like, that song, Black Hole Sun, the song on the cassette. He's like, oh, you like that? And I was like it. Like it, pal. We need to go into a studio immediately and start recording. That's the song right there. And he was like, really? I was shocked by his reaction. Even more shocked by how the rest of the band responded to it.
Wow.
Because they were pretty much the same way. They were kind of like, yeah, it's okay. I was like, are we listening to the same song?
You had to call him after the record was out and be like, hey, I told you so, right? I mean, that was a smash hit.
Well, it was funny because I didn't really have that kind of interaction with those guys. It was more the product manager for the band came in at one point during the record, and he listened to a bunch of tracks, and he got up afterwards and he was like, okay, thanks. And he walked out. What was that? I was like, no reaction at all. I was sitting there thinking, my friend, I've just handed you probably the best rock record that you're going to have anything to do with a couple of years. And all you have to say is like, thanks. But after the record was out, about 3 or 4 months in, he called me, and the only thing out of his mouth was like, I'm so sorry. I was so wrong.
It's wild, man. Music's a weird beast like that. Some people, it's like not even in their time zone. And then in other people, it slays you. Like you listen to the demo of that and it gave you goosebumps, and you knew what to do with it. I think it's brilliant too, that it's like, you've got this thing where it's like, you're not in the band and you recognize that, but you'll fight harder for the integrity of what it is, the vision that you have for the band. You'll be willing at multiple different places to lose your seat at the table because you believe in it. And there's this odd thing that makes people love you because of it, because you took sort of a risk for the record, for the cause. And if you were wrong, that's great. Maybe you're wrong, but at least you do everything that you do to a finite level that is everything you believed it should be. And that's failing in the current music. A lot of records get made where people they turn into gig mode with it. So I applaud you for doing that. It's a lot of respect for you.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
And it's always great too.
You do a lot of pre-production. I know you're a big fan of pre-production. Did you do a lot of pre-production for that record? Or did you just go into the studio and just work it out and do it?
I can say with all certainty that I have never and would never make a record where I go into a studio with an artist and work it out. In my mind, you can't have enough prep work. We're well past the point in our collective history where a guy can write a song on the spot, go into the studio and cut it in 15 minutes. And he's got like a record that winds up selling millions and people talk about it, for decades to come, like Muddy Waters or something like that. We don't have Muddy Waters now. I mean, that's not to say there aren't people who are the rough equivalent or have that kind of talent, but things just aren't set up that way. So the idea of returning to this sort of like quaint ethic or aesthetic, I should say, of how recordings used to be done. To me, it's just foolhardy. It makes no sense at all. And I also think there's a danger with artists who get sucked into the romance of something like that, coupled with a record producer who really just wants to get a recording done as fast as possible, get paid, and get out so he can get on to the next project.
Yeah.
So you've got both those things working in favor of, and plus there are no budgets anymore, as you guys know, to make records to start with, unless you're at the top of the heap, and there's so few of those. Certainly there's no one in the realm of rock music that I can think of who can afford to make a record like that now. To make a record without pre-production, I think, is incredibly dangerous, and I've seen it happen so many times.
You've got your whole website is based around pre-production services.
Essentially, it's more about remote recording. It's more about working remotely than anything else. But I will provide pre-production for people without getting involved directly in their production. That's how strongly I believe in it. And
wow.
Yeah, I mean, because I don't have the same kind of, I guess, skin in the game, so to speak, as a person does who's like a boots on the ground record producer who's going into a recording and is counting the amount of time, the amount of hours that they have to spend with an artist. I can take as much time as I want, or as the artist might require, to get their songs right before they roll in. I mean, my objective in that case is to ensure that the artist has all their material in record ready shape. They're complete. They can just roll into a recording studio, and from that point, do whatever it is they need to do, and use the time in the studio to mess around, getting sounds or experimenting with auxiliary parts and stuff like that, and performances, things that you should be, all the stuff that you should be doing when you're in a recording studio.
Right. And how does that work with a producer that is not you? So you pre-produce the record and hand it off to a producer that then produces the record?
Yeah.
You've got a lot of really, probably some great ideas on what guitar parts should be there and foundational vibes of how it should come out of the speakers. Is that not like frustrating?
No, not in the least.
You're an odd dude. You're a special dude.
Well, my family tell me that too. So,
and you listen to how meticulously the records you do are, and the sounds that you get, and what comes out of the speakers, and you think to yourself, like, how can that guy, like, once you're done with pre-production, I couldn't imagine that you could be happy with the final result. So specific on the little things.
Well, I've had to approach the whole process of recording from a different perspective. To be able to spend the time to do that, to have that, to work with that much detail, you need resources. The records that you've listened to that I've worked on, where you're focusing on all those little details, it's not because someone was lucky enough to throw a mic up and was like, oh, there it is, on to the next.
Right.
That's people like fiddling around with stuff, a lot of fiddling.
To make it
that
truly.
mic doesn't sound, just move the mic a fraction of an inch that way, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so on and so on, to create a cumulative effect that reflects and amplifies the scope of the music even more. But because we don't have the kind of resources to do that anymore, it's virtually impossible.
Dude, that's a heady thing to wrap your mind around. And it's like, it's really challenging for me, like watching you and hearing you talk about that, and me thinking I couldn't do that. But it's like, it's the kind of conversations that when I have with folks, I'm like trying to imagine expanding into that kind of philosophy. It's a heady thing to be able to.
Well,
I only think records happen a couple of ways the way I do them, but then a guy like you says something like that, and I'm like, well, maybe I could. What if I started thinking that way? Would I be capable of actually doing that? And it's something that it's like it's an evolved state, is what I'm saying.
Well, look, there's a bunch of different ways of looking at music production. one of which is the functional aspect of it. And, functional, not just in terms of like I serve a certain function in a recording studio, the function of I make money doing this. This is my job. I am a record producer, so to speak. And those are the angles from which most people look at making records, and the different types of music producers, for example, I talk about in my book a little bit, that there's some people who are good cheerleaders, some people who are good, engineers, and may not be as much up on song arrangement and things like that. But people have to fit into a framework that exists now, unless they don't. Unless they don't, because there's something else that exists, and this is much harder for people to swallow, especially in this particular age, where there's no money to make a record, there's no time to make a record, and who wants to be fiddling around all day, all week, all year, making their record anyway, because I have bills to pay, I got kids to feed, and blah, 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 blah. And life has got more serious things happening besides the world is falling apart, and we've got COVID, and, there's psychopaths running the country and things like that. So, all of a sudden you can deprioritize the concept of what this essentially comes down to. Music is a form of communication. It's an art form. It's a way that we use to express ideas and feelings to other people.
Yeah.
We speak through it. But people don't use it that way anymore because they don't see it that way, because they've deprioritized it so much. It's not even devalue. I mean, I see people use the term devalue a lot, but it's more profound than that. It's it's deprioritizing. It's making it less important. And as we, the creators, make it less important in our own lives, and there are practical reasons why we do that, we think, we make something that resonates less and less with other people. And that's where the disconnect happens.
Dude, it's interesting that you say as we deprioritize it, right? It's that it's us. We blame it always on the labels or what people want or social media, like what they'll allow us to do. But the reality is we're the ones, it's in our hands, and we've made a conscious decision to bend to that.
Well, yeah, that exactly. And that demonstrates a sense of resignation, kind of like giving up, so to speak. Yeah, look, anyone who takes that position isn't wrong. I'm not going to say that anyone's wrong. People have reasons for doing things. No one's wrong as far as I'm concerned in anything. If that's how you feel, that's how you feel, But we also have other things that go on inside of ourselves. We have an inner dialogue, an inner life, and there's such a thing called ethics.
People don't prioritize it at times, but if you are a man of principle, your records will be principled records. You can't make a meaningful record without setting out to do it.
Well, yeah, exactly. You can't, like, I will take the stand that I take because I'm driven by a particular set of ethics, and so far nothing in my life has caused me to willfully set those ethics aside. Whether that makes me right or makes me wrong is totally irrelevant. It feels right to me. It looks completely wrong to someone else, and that's fine. That's their position. That's how they feel about it. But I believe very strongly in being guided by ethics, and letting that be sort of, I guess, kind of like that, and whatever intuition I might have, being the sole arbiters of any choices that I make at all. I don't think that, because when it gets right down to it, most of the choices that we make creatively aren't intellectual ones. We make them intellectual because we have higher logic and reasoning faculties. But really, these decisions are based on something that hits you the wrong way. A musical decision where you have to change something, or you're playing with a sound, trying to get it to fit a certain way with other sounds, or just establishing a baseline for the sonic character of a recording that you're working on, it's all based on something emotion, something sensory that happens inside of you. That's what you're responding to. And what the mistake that's made often is converting that into an intellectual an intellectual exercise, and a way that and finding an intellectual solution. I mean, you can intellectualize it. You can create a logical framework to be able to rationalize why you're doing what you're doing, and using your understanding of equipment, which is also intellectual, to figure out a solution. If it's something where if the solution is based in the equipment that you're using. But everything that we do is based on a sensory response to something that's happening in our environment.
When you talk about Principle, how many records have you gotten thrown off of for Principle?
He's counting.
No, I'm trying to remember, actually. I don't think I've actually been, I've walked off a couple.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. You would think you don't do it because some people would not do it because of fear to lose the gig. But at the end of the day, I think people look at Principle and they say, hey, that guy, he's going for something. We need to give him more leash to do that. You know, it's worked out for you, obviously.
Well, it's easier for me because at the times that I've worked on records like those, no one's going to argue with the kind of track record that I have behind me. And they can also refer back to other times where I've had to have similar conversations with people. Yeah, and I mean, I think back when a lot of this stuff was when some of these things were happening, I sort of relished the idea of being right, per se. But that's not what this is about at all. I mean, and that was my utter misunderstanding. I was basically rolling with what I felt. I was going with what I felt. I was going with my intuition. My intuition speaks very, very loudly to me. But the thing is that everyone has the same faculty if they choose to take advantage of it. It's just that we, as a civilization at this point, are being directed to to head toward a different place.
And how difficult that must be for you to be the guy that doesn't like controversy and arguments, and then have to be the guy that continually does it. Right? I mean, you've already said it's one of your least favorite things, but then you'll have to go to the band and say, the drummer's not cutting it. We need to kick that person off the record. I mean, that's an impossible situation. How do you prepare for that? Is it like you spend a couple days getting your spiel down, or you just go in and in the moment say, hey, this is not good enough and we need to get you out of here and someone else in here?
In a lot of those cases, it's happened pretty quickly. Yeah, I mean, because in the case of recording, like when I work with Hole, for example, like we had done so much prep work before we went into the studio to ensure against something like that. I mean, it's funny. That's one of the ironies of that particular situation. That, before my involvement on that record was actually conditional, because I already had developed a certain reputation for letting drummers go. And the band said to me, we really want to make this record with you, but you can't fire our drummer. And I was like, okay, we won't fire your drummer.
Was that Celebrity Skin?
Yeah, it was.
What a record, man.
Yeah. Thanks. But because of that was my directive, and I tend to follow directives to the letter when an artist has provided me with them. I went to the drummer and I was like, you and me, we're going to be, we're going to be like this, we're going to be working together. We're going to get this right. This is going to be, we're going to be a team, and she was like, okay, cool. And we spent about a month and a half in rehearsal, writing drum parts. And, I just rehearsed her a lot, and she sounded good, when we were in rehearsal. I mean, it wasn't the greatest drumming I'd ever heard, but it was adequate, and I felt that it would serve the record. And then when we went in, it all just kind of fell apart. And we'd been in the studio for about 3 weeks or something like that, and it was actually getting worse. And I had to go to the band and talk to them about it. And they said, do you remember the conversation we had at the beginning of the record? And I was like, yeah, I do. And they were like, she's not going anywhere. You're going to have to make this record with her regardless. And I was like, all right. And then at one point during the process, where we still weren't getting anywhere. And I think I was at the end of my tether. One of the people in the band came in, was at the studio, and I was like, something's got to give here. So I made sure when they came in that I was playing one of the tracks that I knew for sure was like just about the worst drum performance that I could find. Not that it was, I guess you could say that's a terribly manipulative thing to do, and in a way it was. Although I think at that point they were all pretty much on a par. And I remember them hearing this track and recoiling in horror, going like, oh my God, what is that? And I was like, it's your drummer. And they were like, fire!
Awkward.
They stormed out.
Was it the nerves of being the red light and being in the studio as opposed to the rehearsal room? Because you said it was going pretty well during rehearsal.
I'm not clear, and I don't think I ever will be completely. I think that there was like an issue with some substances. That one of the people in the band said this to me, so I had to go on that. One of the things that was happening was that they were the drummer was kind of going off kind of script, so to speak. Like we'd really made very, very tight roadmaps for this record, because it wasn't meant to be kind of more of a jammy type rock record. It was like they wanted to make a pop record. Like they wanted to do something that really went against everything that they'd done before. So that was also part of the directive. And she just started throwing fills in wherever she felt like it, and kind of, doing things that were walking all over the structure of the song, as well as not playing the songs particularly well. And I think that there may have been some nerves involved as well. Although I've never seen it quite that profound. I mean, outwardly, she didn't act as if anything was wrong. It was in hindsight, it was really hard to say.
Isn't it interesting that it's hard for you to say? You're so like focused and laser precision on lyrics, on arrangements, on sounds, production, and even a guy that's so analytical like you still has to give up the vote to the Goosebumps. Still has to say, I don't know what it was totally that wasn't working, but it wasn't. It's so abstract against the very planned out production.
You could hear that the performances were bad. It was very, very clear that they weren't. That they were far from adequate. They're just some of the worst drum performances I heard, which again was a real surprise to me because of the amount of time and energy that she put into like getting her performances right.
Right.
It was something. It was certainly evident enough for her band member to hear, to walk into the room cold, hear the drum performance, and go like, "Whoa, that's bad."
What was the single on that? Was it called Malibu?
That was the second one. The first was Celebrity Skin.
Oh, so that was the name of that song where you go into the chorus like 18 seconds in, right? Ba-down, 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 right?
That's the riff.
Oh, my goodness. That's one of those records, when it came on the radio for me, was like my vision went out. Like I was just like, if I was driving, I would have wrecked because it was like I looked at the radio. That came out, the mix on that, the guitar tones, the song, the hook, the arrangement, the production. When it came on, you don't know anything about anything, but you know that was one of the monster hits of the year. Coming from a totally unexpected source, Courtney Love, right? I mean, no one expected her punk rock band to do something that slick. That guitar tone was crazy. Do you remember what you used to mic it?
One. I remember it well. In fact, I have the entire rig. It's interesting because I'd start on that record. I started to get into processing guitar sounds and running them through synthesizers. And on that record, we actually, someone loaned me a vintage Watkins Dominator. I don't know if you're familiar with this amplifier. It's a wedge front, really like relatively tiny combo amp from like the early 60s, I think. And it's they're vintage amps. I mean, they're pretty valuable. Like a mint one's going to be like $5,000-6,000.
Yeah.
This one was absolutely tattered. It was beat to hell, and it was owned by Jakey Lee, who used to play with Ozzy. And he had not treated this amp well, but what he did do was he took the original speakers out and he replaced them with Marshall vintage 30s, I think. And I don't know what happened or what was going on with this amp, but it was like the voice of God. It was kind of like this weird combination of the best AC30 you've ever heard with like the best sort of like JMP 50 watt or JTM 45 type Marshall. It was just so good. And it's tiny. It was tiny, but if you put like a mic up to the right on the speaker, it would sound like an amp that was much, much bigger.
Well, that blows me away that you're telling me that's a small amp. It's a what
it
is
sounded
it?
like it. Well, I'm not done though. I'm not done. See, there's more to it. That amp sounded amazing. I'm pretty sure it was just a 57 and an RCA BK5.
Oh, hold it. I brought this up from the studio.
There it is.
I got one of these, and then you told me that you used it on all the Soundgarden records, and I was like, "Oh snap! I got to start using this on every guitar." Maybe I'll get that Beinhorn sound.
It just goes well with a mic like a 57. Yeah, I love those things.
Yeah, I had mine redone by Clarence Kane, with an original ribbon that was old new stock. So
he's the guy.
So you had a 57 and a BK5B on it?
Pretty sure, yeah. But
that gain was being made at the amp?
What's that?
That gain was being made at the amp, or is it a foot pedal?
Some of it.
Okay, go. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Good.
No, it's okay. See, because I was splitting. I was going into a splitter, and not an A/B splitter. It was actually a MIDI splitter, a ground control, which actually had audio ports, audio outs on it, and for some reason the buffer stage in it didn't load amps. You know how when you split from an A/B switch, the signal will come back from the amplifier and it'll basically create a feedback loop and load the circuit down in your amps, right? So you end up with a sound that's not as good as just the guitar plugged into the single amp would be. Even though you got both the amps running, by all rights it should be better. So for some reason this splitter, and I wish to God I could remember the actual configuration because you had to wire it a certain way, but it was incredible. It didn't load anything down, so you were able to pretty much preserve the signal as it was going through the splitter into the amp. So I was splitting into three things. The second thing I split into was a Sans amp. A Sans amp rack.
Yeah.
But the third thing I split into was a whole synth rig. And what that was an ARP 2600. The gain, the preamp stage on an ARP 2600 is actually one of the best like stomp box type distortion things I've ever heard in my life. And if you patch straight into the preamp and then patch through to the output stage and then out of there, it sounds incredible. It sounds so good. It's a very musical transistor distortion, which is not always easy to find. From there, I went into a Surge modular system. So I was processing the living daylights out of that guitar. So a lot of the heavy guitar sound on that record is processed like that, and I would do like subtle modifications on the.
So the ARP wasn't a keyboard sound; you were using it for its input and output stage.
That's it. Yeah, yeah. It was just wide open.
And if you were to go and ISO just the 57 on that, how much of the spirit of that end guitar sound is just the 57 or the BK5B right off of the front of that amp. That Watson.
Just the 57?
Well, let's say if you ISO just the 57 or the BK5B that was on the Watson, right?
Watkins.
Okay, Watkins. If you just
so you get it right, in case you start going on eBay.
So if you ISO just those tracks on your originals, how much of that is what percentage of that is the final percentage of all your combinations?
Well, it's tough to say because like we're bouncing down to a single track at that point.
Oh, so you stored them live. You didn't keep them separate and then mix them during the mix, the 3 elements.
No, you got what you got.
Well, that's another great point here. We get files sent to us to mix that have 100 and some tracks on it, 8 kick drums and samples and snares and guitar direct lines and bass direct lines. And at a certain point, when are you going to produce a record? You're the producer, right? You got to make some decisions and commit that guitar sound to tape. How do you feel about that?
You know what? I've done that myself, where I've split things up into different, into different channels. I think it's a horrible way to work.
You're at the mercy of the mix engineer.
You're at the mercy of the mix engineer. And yeah, I don't like working that way.
Right?
You know,
that's why they hire you.
It sucks. The only time the times that I've done that was essentially because I literally couldn't hear what I was doing in the control room that I was in, which is one reason again why I don't like I don't like recording. I don't like going into studios anymore because I don't know what I don't know what I'm hearing.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So real quick, the Right Track story. I was working at Right Track in the 90s on a session, maybe the early 2000s, who knows. And my assistant told me that Michael Beinhorn made Con Edison shut down part of the grid to Times Square. Tell me the level of truthfulness to this story to find a ground loop.
I don't think that they would have shut the grid down.
So that's not true.
I don't have that kind of juice. We did have Con Edison come out. It was interesting. Recording some high gain guitars in one of their rooms. And we went out to dinner. We came back, we plugged the guitar in, and it just had this horrible like, and nothing had changed, and we were scratching our heads. We swapped out cables, swapped out guitars, swapped out amp heads, swapped out speaker cabinets, everything, the works. We wound up going to other studios. We wound up, they built a Faraday cage for us in the room. That was like a coffin for the guitarist to stand in.
Meanwhile, downstairs, some guy just plugged his electric razor in down in the apartment underneath you, probably. I mean,
it was worse than that. We actually found out what it was. The day that Con Edison came, so the best part of that story, was that there was one of the, like a peep show thing, a peep show theater that was right next to the studio, and it had like a shared like sort of fire stairwell. So you could actually open the door on the Right Track side and open the door on the peep show side and actually look in and see what people were doing in the peep show. So Con Ed came in, and they had to go through the whole building, which included going into the peep show. So they were kind of walking around with like meters and stuff like that. And I opened the door to watch, and I was seeing, they would walk into like places where abusing themselves watching girls, and the guys were like running out. Like, it was very funny. It is a great story.
Did they find it? What was it?
Yeah, they did. They got in a truck. And this is actually the funniest part. They got in a truck with a Telecaster in a little, like one of those little, like a pig nose type amp, like a portable. And they drove all around the city searching for where this hum was coming from, because it was all over the building, and it was metering too. They went everywhere. They drove up and down the city. They found one area, like about a half block, where the hum kind of mysteriously vanished. We discovered that it was a TV or a radio transmitter on a building someplace that was just burning out. And yeah, so we couldn't do anything about it. Like the studio manager contacted the FCC, and the FCC was like, you know, recording, like I get, you know, I get more money from, you know, in 15 minutes from a lobbyist, you know, who walks in, you know, giving me money to, you know, for a sponsor someplace that you make in an entire year. Get out of my face. So that was the end of that.
And for those who don't know, Right Track was one of the premier rooms in New York City, even back in the heyday of recording. It was one of the finest examples of wrap-around, giant $1 million console rooms that if you went in there with your own tape, I remember they would charge you an uncorking fee. Meaning, like, if you brought your own tape and you didn't buy their tape at the $300 a reel or whatever they were selling it, they charged you $50 to use your own tape in that room. So it was it was pretty high on the. If you were working at a Right Track consistently, you were doing pretty good. Was that one of your favorite rooms in town?
It was, and it's funny because it wasn't even the best studio in the city.
What was the best studio in the city?
I don't know. I mean, I loved Right Track. I loved being there. Like as far as like a live room goes, it wasn't a place that I would have tracked drums or anything like that. But it was a great place to do overdubs. The rooms were good. Like the control room sounded good. And of course, they were one of the first places that had a J series. At that point in time, I really liked J series.
Yeah.
In hindsight, I think I would probably have gone back to like a G.
Well, I think that when they bought that console, they gave them like 48 1081s too, didn't they? So they had this
sure.
SSL made this. Oh, maybe it must have been their Neve room. So they had a big Neve elliptical one that when they shipped, they also gave them like 48 rack-mounted 1081s with it.
Data Capricorn, yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking of another one, like a VR.
They
Elliptical
didn't have
VR
in that place. I don't think so.
I can't imagine why they would give an SSL, give it with the, because I thought that it was part of the buy deal to get the 1081s. But go ahead. What were we talking about? I'm sorry.
I also recall, and I may have you mistaken, Michael, but my first trip ever to Right Track was a buddy of mine was the worked the front desk, and he said, "You want to go down and see where Michael Beinhorn's working?" I was like, "Yes." So, there was if I recall, there was a concert-sized PA system set up. Is that accurate? Do I have my memory?
I don't think we did that in Right Track.
It was the downstairs room at Right. It was a big room, and it had a full PA setup. And I'm almost sure he linked it to you, but maybe I'm wrong.
That's the problem with these stories. They get sort of like telephoned around. And
that would have been Power Station, I think.
Was Power Station your favorite live room?
Power Station was one of the best live rooms.
Yeah.
You know, I didn't work at Hit Factory just because the reputation they had, I think, because I think every studio had their kind of like extras that they would tack on to the you know, overall bill. But I think Right Track were the most notorious, and you know, you'd see stuff on. People would tell me about seeing stuff on bills for like toilet paper rolls and things like that. And,
or for the monitors that are sitting on the console. We got billed for the NS10s.
Yeah,
as if we had requested them. You know.
Yeah, exactly. A rental. But yeah, I mean, in hindsight, I think it was the two main places that I worked in New York were Power Station and Right Track. And I mean, I've done most of my work out in Los Angeles.
Were there any crummy studios that were still like nice Neve rooms, like Loho and all these Looking Glass or Sorcerer Sound? Or remember those studios that still had really good gear back in the era of a lot of studios? Were there any of those that you loved?
No, not really.
Were you tough, like when you were coming in, were people like, "Oh God, here comes Michael Beinhorn"? Make sure that everything is right.
Probably.
Yeah.
You know, but it's a funny thing how like you never get to hear about that kind of stuff. Like people won't tell you, hey, you're kind of a jackass when it comes to like, when it comes to picking studios and stuff like that. You're a ball buster.
Well, I went to your legend in New York City. It's like I'd hear these stories about Michael Beinhorn shutting down the grid to find a ground loop, and I believed them. So, some of that was true, but it's like those are the things that people were not willing to do. Regular producers and engineers weren't willing to do that. And I would argue that it made a difference. I think that your records, some of those records sonically and arrangement-wise and production-wise they still are killing it today. If you put any of those three records or the two records we've been talking about just in this, they would be hits today on radio. They would change because, pop music changes as to who is at the top of the charts. It could be a resurgence of rock and roll. Yeah. I mean, those are seminal records.
I think all it would take. Well, it would take a major sea change for that to happen at this point.
But the music, if you're just talking about putting it on the radio and people having a summer and having Black Hole Sun dominate their summer, right? That's the kind of thing that, yeah, man, it's good enough to
listen
do that.
To it. So I'm not complaining.
How many records did that sell?
I think it's up around like 12 million now worldwide.
Wow. That's nice. You got to get some plaques up on those bare walls of yours. Look at you. You got a what's that? You got a fan, one of those circle fans in the back, a couple of doors, and blank walls.
I put a couple up. You just don't see the other wall.
Yeah, that's where you keep because you could see it. It keeps your ego up.
I don't go. Yeah, I don't go too crazy. I mean, I still have like all the plaques that I have are still they're still like album plaques, like vinyl.
Yeah.
Nowadays you get them with CDs on them, and they're more like compact and stackable and things like that.
They look like YouTube awards.
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah.
Are you working on anything that's really exciting you right now in the record world?
Well, essentially, the work that I'm doing now is primarily pre-production and remote production, and I'm doing that with a bunch of different people. What I love about this is that it's completely removed from the music industry. That's one thing that works. I mean, I'm finding that when you work with artists at a certain strata, all of a sudden a lot of the things that you liked or that I liked about working on big budget records are kind of there again, because we're not dealing with time with the same kind of time constraints. Because, as I like to say to this is one of my favorite things to say to people: no one a record.
One more time, you glitched out there.
No one's waiting for your record.
Uh-huh.
No one's waiting for your next record. Which I think that you can take that as being highly insulting on the one hand, and on the other hand, you can take it as being like, okay.
Liberating. Yeah,
it's like about the most liberating thing in the world, because you don't have to, there's no constraint on you. No one's looking down your shoulder, breathing down your neck. The only person who's putting pressure on it in this case is you. Yeah. So if you remove that element from the creative process, all of a sudden, oh wow, I feel so much better. I can really create. I can really make the kind of record I want, and that means.
Can you walk me through, let's say I was an artist and I hired you and went into pre-production with you. It would start off with listening to songs, talking about orchestrations. Tell me what the process looks like. And at what point you say, bingo, you're ready to go in the studio?
Well, what happens is that people present me with music first, and I'm going to vet it and see if it's something that I not just that I want to work on, but something that I feel I can really contribute to. I mean, this working like this really democratizes the process. So I don't need to be as picky and choosy as I used to be about the projects I did, because I'm not operating from the same place anymore. It's not really produced by Michael Beinhorn. My function is totally different. For all practical intents and purposes, I'm more of a consultant now, but it's a creative consultant. So it's something that's fulfilling to me. What I do is if I'm doing pre-production on a person's record, I just sit and listen to their music, make notes, make them as extensive as possible. send them back to the artist, and from there we talk about it. You know, we have a discussion, you know, the same as we're doing right now via Zoom or something like that. And we talk about how they need to be implemented. And that whole process goes back and forth 3 times. By the end of the 3rd time, everything's usually in place enough where the artist is in a position to go and record what they've got however they want to do it. You know, generally speaking, all people need is a light shined on what it is that they have to look at. And it's always stuff that they either didn't think about before, or something that was in the back of their mind and nagging away at them, but they just weren't sure about it or didn't understand why it was bothering them. So it's a very educational and inspiring process for artists, because they have an opportunity to look at what they're doing from a completely different perspective.
It's like almost a la carte A&R service. More into the creative space, so maybe not, like, because it's more about orchestration, songwriting, and arrangement. But it's kind of something that has been taken away from the normal structure of music business. It's it is. Well, I guess it's like maybe it is more like pre-production in the sense that you're not making the record. They're going off and doing that some other way.
Yeah, but I discovered that I don't need to make the record. That's the thing. Right. Like, my function, what we've kind of bought into this idea that a record producer has to do X, Y, and Z. You know, depending, of course, on the kind of music that you're doing, and depending on the aesthetic of the producer. But it's not like that. I mean, the world has changed drastically. You know, we can modify how we work according to how the world is going. We don't have to stick with these kind of burnished, kind of, I guess, tried and true on one level, or decaying and kind of dinosaur paradigms, for record making. We can evolve too, and we can do things differently.
It's not as obvious as you would think. Talking to you, it seems to me like that I have always seen a ball for being a ball, so I always assume in the future it will be a ball. But it's like there is sort of a existential thing that you have to be able, and it makes a great record producer. You have to be able to look at the same thing differently continually to make records like you've made that aren't the first shelf of decisions. These are well thought out. Your vision comes from being able to see something uniquely that is very much the same with a lot of things. So it's an interesting talent.
There's an element of critical thinking that goes into it as well that you have to rely on. That obviously speaks to the logical aspect of, actually it's a combination of the logical and sort of like the sensory aspect of working in an art form. If your instincts are telling you the same thing consistently, you have to alter your thinking. If what you can't seek confirmation bias, which frankly I feel that I was doing for years, and I think people who produce records still are, but you can't really do that anymore. That's not true. You can, but it's not going to lead anywhere constructive.
You're so creative and so analytical. It's very rare to find that in one person that is like able to be a true artist 100%, but then be able to look at it and deduce all that, decide what is possible, what is, the vision for something. Those are usually two different dudes, right?
I guess.
Not with you. Yeah, not with you.
I guess. Well, there's a lot more to life than making records, I mean, you can...
There is?
I'm sorry, I know. But, I think that music production can serve you as a microcosm of what the entire picture is. Yeah. And how you kind of treat that process can be an extrapolation. And in my instance, I feel it has to be of how one lives their life in general. I mean, why, if I'm doing something and I don't see it merely as an occupational thing, but more as a situational, existential, and an extension of an expression of who I am, why would I cheapen that and turn it into like simply a matter of paying bills, simply a matter of functionality in my life.
Yeah, that's cool, dude. Well, it's been an inspiration talking to you. Where can people find you? Is it michaelbeinhorn.com?
michaelbeinhorn.com. Yeah, I'm working on it. I'm putting together a new website right now, which is still kind of in foundational.
Is Facebook or Instagram
stage.
a thing for you?
Yeah, I mean, if people contact me through Facebook, I'll ask them to touch base through my website so we can make it more official. But yeah. And
we didn't even talk about your book, but you've got a book out that's a very cool book. That's How I Met You. Tommy Hayes, a good dude. I love Tommy Hayes.
That's
introduced
right, yeah.
the two of us. So big shout out to Tommy. Thank you for that, buddy. It's been a real inspirational activity talking to you. Both times we've talked, it really makes me want to rethink some of my presuppositions, that's a pretty strong day when you can talk to somebody and you're like, you know what? I'm going to try to see that a little differently, start thinking a little bit differently. In such a polarized political world and social world, when someone can truly talk to someone and have the idea that they need to maybe adjust the way they're living their life, that's saying something. And you've done that for me, bud. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure.
I feel like every artist I'm working with, I want them to listen to this. There's some real gems in here that we're a good reminder of, like, writing from the heart. Don't try to write for your audience. That stuff is huge, man. And people forget it all the time.
Yeah.
They don't forget it. It's actually outside, and it's so strange to say this. It's really outside of their purview because no one's ever said that to them, and they have nothing to exemplify that. I mean, by the best that people can do these days is to, like, say, hey, go listen to Led Zeppelin 4 or something like that, or go listen to Exile on Main Street. I mean, they're great records, but it's kind of like, okay, and now what? Because to some people that would be like an immediate connection to something that you don't already know, but to other people it'll be like, okay, so what? What is that supposed to mean to me? When what you're trying to evoke to someone is this idea of how do we speak to people? How do we emote? How do we, how do we create the context for them that we want an audience, that we want a larger group of people to get into? And if they're not hip to that, if they don't have an innate understanding of what that is, because, and no one's ever talked about this because the understanding always was innate. It's just not there anymore. It's not present in the creative process. So how can people know it? The only way that they can know it is if you bring it to their attention, like, hey, it's about this, it's about that. If you feel something, you don't just intellectualize it. It's not just up here. You actually feel it in your body. To be able to present those ideas to people, that's when their minds get blown and they're like, oh shit, wow, okay, cool.
That's next level.
Yeah, well,
it's next level.
I mean,
that's
the job.
Here's the best compliment I think I can pay you is that if someone said, hey, I'm working on a project, I want to work on it with you, and I'm working with Michael Beinhorn, like, that is the idea that you could be in the room with somebody that you respect and you think you're going to do some stuff that maybe you haven't seen before, or think some thoughts, or to have a philosophy of the record you're going to be working on that was something like, man, that's something that I haven't even experienced. This is the kind of compliment I would want paid to myself, is that people would be excited to be in a creative endeavor with you. So
thanks.
You're a good dude, man. Look forward to
Thank you.
seeing whatever you do. I mean, you're just waiting on the next great thing. So
thanks.
We'll have your website, your socials, and a link to your book down in the description. Go check it out. Thanks so much for a great day. And from the West Barn, we're signing off.